very fascinating guest and topic with me today. During his 50 years in the field as an orthodontist, he started to notice interesting patterns of behavior and wanted to figure out how he could best help every patient. By getting to know everyone in his chair carefully, he theorized that a person's birth order had a large effect on how they behaved and interacted with the world. Researching further into the concept of birth order continued to confirm his hypothesis. He's even gone so far as to add to the concept, coining the term double birth order, making for a more accurate assessment of someone's birth order archetype. Today, we're going to find out what all that means with a Dr. Robert Hurst. Dr. Robert, welcome to the show.
Welcome to you too.
Very, very glad to have you here. This is a very fascinating topic and one that is relevant to all people, whether they realize it or not. Is that right?
That's true. And it affects their life in every aspect of their life. It's kind of like a background current that's going on behind them all the time. And it's influencing everything they say, do, and interact with other people, but they're probably not aware of it. And all I'm going to do is give you enough information to realize these things are really happening. You know, what's interesting, some people might say, well, what is birth order? Well, the simplest thing is your numerical order of birth, but that's just way too simple. But if you look at the family photo album, you'll get your first view of how it affects you. That first child, and I think you might have been one of those, has the most pictures in the album. And as you go further down the birth order line, you get less and less pictures. And by the time you get to the fourth child, they're lucky to have one picture in there. So, you know, that's kind of the evidence that birth order is working, but it's kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah, very fascinating. And I would hypothesize that it not just affects how one behaves in social scenarios, but also perhaps how one believes and thinks about themselves and kind of their own internal perception of themselves as well. Would you say that that's correct?
That's absolutely correct. What birth order does, it allows you to understand who you are. That's the most important part. You're not going to change. And people really, they might change on the surface, but deep down inside, they're the same person they've always been. And I've noticed that when I've been following my patients from childhood to adulthood and beyond. And these kids they're the same as their 50-year-old adults as they were when they're 10-year-old kids. And they interact the same way. It's really fascinating.
It is. It is. And so that's a very strong statement right there in that people don't change. Do you believe that as a firm end all statement? Do you think it is impossible for someone to, at their core, change how they are or how they present? Or is it perhaps in extenuating circumstances?
Well, if you understand who you are and how you respond to things, then you can make changes in your behavior, but that doesn't change your core. You just understand how you interact or don't interact with some people. You know, in life, there are people that you might say, you know, that's a person I just don't want to be around anymore. And you don't know why, except that you just don't get along, and you're not going to change that person, their beliefs. And so you say, it might just be best to leave that person out of my social circle. So you can make that decision not to try to change somebody because you're not going to change either. You know, the birth orders have basic principles that go with them. For instance, the firstborn child starts off life as an only child. He doesn't become a firstborn until the second child is born. So when he's an only child, he's really an amalgamation of his parents' birth orders, whatever they are. And when he gets a sibling, then he becomes a firstborn. And the firstborn wants to be perfect. They don't want to make mistakes. And they want to tell others what to do. You know, they can be the leaders. Well, a secondborn doesn't want to be told what to do and doesn't want to be anything like that firstborn. kids all want to be different, and each kid in a family takes their specific role. So between 1 and 2, it's interesting. They are the most prone to sibling rivalry. Remember the story in the Bible, Cain and Abel. Well, that didn't work out too well. But number 2 always wants to knock off number 1, and number 1 always wants to hold the throne. Now, gender differences make a difference. Sometimes if the boy is first and then the girl is second, it's too difficult for her to dethrone him. So they take their special roles as 1 and 2. But sometimes when there's 2 boys, first 2 are boys, and number 2 boy gets bigger than number 1 boy, and then they're out in public and they say, "Oh, you must be the older one." No, 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 I'm the younger one. Well, that doesn't sit too well with number 1. So here we go with sibling rivalry. Now number 2 is bigger, and now he wants to take number 1's position. The problem is that when he takes number 1's position and number 1 drops out, he takes on all the roles of number 1, and he's a number 2 as well. So it gets more difficult for him because now he has 2 roles to play.
Fascinating. And so to back up a little bit before we get too far off the fundamental concept of what someone's core is what someone and who someone is to their core strictly a function of birth order? Is it strictly a function of who perhaps their soul is when it's born? Is it a mixture of both and environmental factors? Like, where does someone's core come from and who they are?
Well, let me back up a second and get into psychology a little bit. The guy who started the whole concept of birth order, his name was Alfred Adler, and he was a contemporary of Freud. In fact, they were in the same psychoanalytical society together. And Freud said, your core, who you are, is related to your parents, and your interaction with your parents is who you are. And Adler said, no, that's not true. It's the interaction with your siblings of who you are and how you interact with these siblings. And what's interesting is that a number 1 sibling, a number 2 sibling, a number 3 sibling, a number 4 sibling all have individual characteristics that seem to go from family to family. And you say, how can that be? It's just how everyone takes a different role within the family. So with Adler, it's your interaction between your siblings that make you who you are. Now, there are some problems that can occur. It's not so simple as 1, 2, 3, 4, because we have to look at the family structure and see what happened in the family to find out what your real birth order, or as you say, your real core is. For instance, let's say the second child in the family had a physical defect, a mental defect, so that the parents had to spend a lot of effort and time and money on that number 2 child. Well, the number 1 child says, wait a minute, I'm supposed to get all the attention. What's happening here? And they can't say anything negative about number 2 because, well, that would just be wrong. So what they do is they carry throughout their life this, you might call it some hostility, some anger. And so, not everyone is the same. It's all those little interactions that make up who you really are. And I came up with about 7 or 8 characteristics, items that you need to understand to find your real birth order. It's like, who did you really grow up with? Were there multiple births within the family, like a set of twins? A set of twins takes all the effort, and then the other kids get ignored. So even though everyone has similar numbers, it's that family structure that really finds out who you really are and how you react to things.
Fascinating. So yeah, let's dive deeper into what actually birth order is, and perhaps true birth order versus a generic birth order, hypothesis or theory. And so, to summarize and give you a foundation to stem from, birth order in true birth order, as you say, is not necessarily just I was born first, I was born second, I was born third. but extenuating circumstances, including but not limited to a child that takes an exorbitant amount of parental resources, be that time or attention. We've also in our pre-chat mentioned the blending of families, perhaps stepchildren being in the equation or adoption of a child maybe could come into play. So what other factors, and you mentioned that there was eight, I believe, just now or seven. What are all of the factors that come into consideration for someone's true birth order
Well,
beyond just the siblings?
well, to start with, your number of birth. That's how you start. That's how you get your number. Okay, but then the next factor would be the spacing between the children. If you have 4 or more school years between siblings, you gain another birth order. And what happens is that when one sibling is away at school, especially if there's a 4 year difference, then that number two sibling gets all the parenting like an only child. And so they add to their number all the characteristics of an only child. So it amplifies, intensifies, and magnifies all the characteristics of their number, because now you've just powered them up with all the, you might say that the parent gives the only child a lot of self-esteem. And so you add that to the number two, or you can add it to the number one, and you get more power. It's very interesting that most of the people in the world today that are movers and shakers all have that only birth order connected to their number that seems to give them this extra power, this extra push in the world. It's a fascinating thing. And that's something that other people that have been working with birth order don't seem to mention or even understand. And what happened with me is that I started using birth order in my office because I wanted to get the cooperation of my kids. Because as an orthodontist, you need their cooperation to get a good result. And I used the typical theories of birth order, an only child of 1, a 2, a 3, a 4. And only about a third of my patients fit the bill. I almost threw the whole thing out. And then I went and I did a research with all the patient families. And I found out that 2/3 of my patients were separated from their brothers and sisters by at least 4 years. So 2/3 of my patients all had these double birth orders, which gave them much more power and accentuated all their factors of their birth order, which was then all of a sudden things started to work.
Fascinating. So when it classifies as a double birth order, being that there's that 4 or more year gap, it's not necessarily a changer of someone's birth order archetype, but more so an amplifier of what they already are. Is that so?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, there are two types of double. I don't want to get into the weeds here, but there's two types of double birth orders. The simplest is when you space your children 4 years apart. And those are families that are not very cohesive. When you have a family that has child after child 1 or 2 years apart, boy, those are all big families. But when you take a family and you have 4 years between, let's say, 3 siblings, now you got a 12-year span. And those siblings don't interact very much with the other sibling because they're just too far apart. When a child is 4 and another one's 8, they're not going to have the same friends. And, one will be out of high school, but the other one starts. So that's one type of double birth order. The other type of double birth order is when you have a 4 or more year span between groups of children. For instance, there are 4 children. The first 2 are a year apart. Then there's a 4-year gap. And then the next 2 are a year apart. Well, that third child is the oldest in the second family. So he has both a 1 and a 3 birth order. By the way, that was Princess Di. She had 2 older sisters. And then Princess Di was born, and she had a younger brother. So Princess Di was a 1 and a 3. And if you think about her characteristics, she wanted to be in charge, but she also had the three side, and she was more interested in saving people from unexplosive, uh, bombs that had been placed in the ground. And she had she cared about children. She was a school teacher. So she had two different personalities, and that's what happens when you get a double birth order with the two ordinal numbers. You have a little mix of the one and the three. And what happens then, these kind of people, you don't know who you're talking to on that particular day. Are you talking to number one or are you talking to number three? And that adds for some confusion, but it also adds for a very rich personality. That's another way to look at it.
Yeah, very fascinating. And so I imagine someone in that circumstance would find themselves embodying the one energy in some circumstances, but then other times falling into that three energy, whether that's conscious or unconscious or ideal or not. Perhaps they just have both of those waves within them that kind of ebb and flow as they navigate life. That's certainly very fascinating. And
Right.
so let's extrapolate beyond a nuclear family scenario and talk about how the concept of birth order might come into play in other scenarios. For example, what if there are two families, if you will, in a household, in the sense that, all right, here's mom, dad, and then kid or kids, but then maybe auntie and uncle and their kids, so someone's cousins. Is it, do they end up getting included in the equation and in the numeric value because they're in the same area? Do they have to live together 24/7 to be included? Or what if they just get together very often? Like, how out group can be involved in the birth order scenario?
Well, I try to say it's who you grew up with during the first 16 years of your life. And well, you've opened up all kinds of things here. I'm going to give you some stories. I'm going to give you some examples. Um, what can happen sometimes in combined families, especially when we have divorces and remarriages, and they bring their children into the family together, if they're living together, immediately their birth orders can change based on their ages in the family. So if you were brought into a family that had an older sibling than you, then you would have lost your birth order and you would have moved down. So some of the kids, when you bring them together based on the ages, move up in birth order, some move down in birth order. And when that happens, the ones that move down in birth order do not adapt well to the new relationship. Now, when you're talking about friends and people coming over, well, kids in a playground, kids in a sandbox, they immediately figure out birth order and who's in charge, and who has the pail and the bucket and who's handing out the it's instinctive that it happens. So, but to have a real effect, they have to be living together, not just visiting. Sometimes in a divorce situation, and I'll give you a story. I had sometimes in an orthodontic office, you're treating many families in the community, and a lot of them with children with both parents, and they get divorced and then they get together and whatever. And happened to be there was two families that were just that way in my family, in my office. One had two daughters, and one was an only child. And the only child, her name was Tiffany. We're not giving any last names here, but Tiffany always wanted another father. So she was really excited when her mother decided to marry this other fellow. But Tiffany really liked her own room and her own stuff, and so she told her mom, "Look, let's not sell our house yet, but let's see how this works out." So after they got together, Tiffany found herself demoted from an only child to a number three. Now she has two older sisters, and they were all sharing the same room. Tiffany didn't like it. Tiffany was not getting along with this situation at all. And only children have a lot of influence over their parents. They're like little adults. And she convinced her mother that it was time to get another divorce. And so She split off from the family. They were back to their own house. But when Tiffany was in the new relationship, she went from a great little patient to one that was having trouble in school. She was having all kinds of problems because she was demoted. She didn't like it. She didn't know what happened to her, but she didn't like it. And then after she got back with her mom in her own house, she became Tiffany again like she was before. It didn't affect the other two girls because they were both older than Tiffany. So they had no problem with it, but Tiffany did. So that's an example, and that happens all the time. So what's nice about birth order is we can predict the relationship, who is going to work out well in this new combined family and who isn't. So that was a great question.
Fascinating. And so beyond sibling changes and interactions, what about the changes that occur in parental arrangements? For example, what if a child of any birth order becomes a parentified figure in the sense that they get then the burden placed upon them in some way of caretaker of one of the parents or both of the parents or of the other children? Does that change someone's true birth order, or does that just kind of alter someone's representation of their actual birth order?
Well, if we're talking about as adults, and then families need to lean on the children for help. Let's say the parents are ill or whatever. But the number one is the guy or girl that's in charge and makes the rules, and then the other children follow down the line. But what happens is sometimes number one says, I don't want any part of this thing. Well, then number two has to move up and take over those responsibilities that number one had. There's still a number two, but now they're functioning more within the family as a number one. It happens a lot when divorce situations occur and you lose one of the parents, either the wife or the husband or whatever, then the oldest sibling seems to take on that parental role in the family. Not exactly, but, over the other children. They want to say, these are the rules, these are what we have to live by. Mom's not here, or dad's not here, or, we have to step up and do what's right. So, yes, these things do happen. And that's why I'm saying your real birth order is just not your number. You have to look at the family situation. You have to see what's going on in the family. Like I said, were there any problems with any other children? Were there multiple births in the family? Who were they living with? Sometimes the oldest child, especially if it's a different gender than the others, ends up living with the grandparents. And then let's say there's a girl and three boys. Well, the girl ends up living with the grandparents. Grandma loves her. And so she's kind of raised as an only child. And then her three other brothers take on the role of 1, 2, and 3. So you really have to look at the family structure to get a real feel of who you are. And that's why a lot of these books on birth order, where they say, oh, you're a 1, you're a 2, and they don't factor in all these other things, it won't work, because it didn't work in my practice. When I tried to look at my patients, it didn't work.
Yeah.
Then I started looking at the family and find out who they really were, so that helped.
Fascinating. And so we've talked a lot already about what makes someone a 1 or a 2 and what might happen to that change around and as that changes around. But let's get into what those actually even look like. So can you give a summary, as brief or as in-depth as you'd prefer, on what is a 1? What are the characteristics, the pros, the cons, the strengths, the weaknesses of a 1, and then so forth for the 2, 3, and however many you do identify?
That's good. And in fact, what's good about your question is that there are positive and negative sides to every birth order. It's not all sweetness and light. There's always two sides. But so let's start. It's an easy one to start with. Let's start with the only child. The only child is self-confident. They want to please the parents. They can be like miniature adults, but they also can be spoiled in that they feel their power. So they put the power over the parents, and the parents give them everything they wanted. Remember the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory?
Yeah.
We had two kinds of only, they were all only children. And we have two kinds. Charlie was the responsible little adult only child, and all the others were spoiled in some way. So those are the two sides to the only child. And only child, they're very self-confident and they're not afraid maybe to start a business or do anything where someone else might say, I'm a little hesitant, but they're a lot of times they're given a lot of self-confidence by the parents. You might think of them as a different generation. They're the adult. And in schools, that's the kid in the classroom that the other kids say, go talk to the teacher, because they're not afraid of adults, because adults are their peer group. And it's also the kid that might end up being the president of the senior class, because he's not afraid to get up and talk. And so, the other kids look up to him as like an adult figure. So that's the only child. The number one, well, remember, he started as an only, so he still wants to please the parents. And he usually does very well in school. He likes to be in charge. He likes to tell others what to do. He's very responsible. And he takes on the feelings of the parents. If the parents are very conservative, then he'll be. If the parents are very liberal oriented, then he'll be that way too. So he's kind of like that secondary parental figure over the other children. I'll give you an example of two. He wants to be in charge and give orders. Well, Hillary Clinton is a one, and she likes to give orders. But Julia Childs is a one also, and she controlled by cooking and giving good things. So sometimes you've heard the expression, I cook for you, I bake for you, I do your clothes, and I don't get any respect. That's another way a one says, look, I want to be in charge. I'm going to be in charge because I'm going to give you everything, versus telling you what to do, going to make you feel guilty. So it's just another way of controlling the situation, by, being a giving mom. Okay, that can happen. Now, number twos, they want to be as different from number one as they can be. Number one is telling them what to do. They do not want to be told what to do. In fact, a lot of people say, you're the stubborn number two. Well, they're not stubborn. They just don't want to be told what to do. So you have to, with a number two, you have to explain everything to them. With my number two patients, I never just do something. I say, this is what I'm going to do. And do you have any questions? Because if they don't want me to do it, they're not going to let me to do it. Number two is usually a better athlete than number one, because they want to be different. Number one is the student, and they got a couple years advantage. So number two becomes the athlete. Number two can have a much more outgoing personality, and number one may be more bookish because they're a little more reserved. Number two can be very competitive, and they can be a rebel. Where this all started, it kind of started back in England. If you remember the stories about the kings, and if the firstborn was going to become the king, what was the secondborn going to do? Sometimes he had to knock off the firstborn to become the king. Okay, and that was kind of a birth order thing. You had your birthright was being number one, and everybody, the king wanted to have children, and the first child is going to take over the monarchy, and of course we see that now in England. But number two, he's the prodigal son. He's not going to follow number one into dad's business. He's going to go out and find his own way. Okay, he's not accepted. Number one's got it. Number two's got to find something else. Now we get into number three. Number three is very interesting. When number three is born, they have to understand 17 different interactions within the family. between the mom and the dad, between number one and number two, number one and the mom and the dad, and number, just, and so as children, as adults, they become very good at handling groups of people and instinctively understanding what's going on around them. They don't see life like one and two. They're more artistic. They like to save the world. They have a world's view. They're very intuitive. You might find them as musicians or artists. They could be school teachers, they're nurses. I always say they're laughing on the outside and crying on the inside because they don't want to let people know what they really feel like because they're so sensitive. And sometimes they can really cover it. Like an example would be Rosie O'Donnell. Believe it or not, she's a 3. She appears tough as nails on the outside, but she's not. She's really sweet on the inside, but she doesn't want anyone to know it. So she covers it up. Number 3s are great at watching what happens between 1 and 2. They might even be the instigators of the fights between 1 and 2. And they say, oh, I had nothing to do with it. But they know what's going on and they like to, play the role because they can manipulate people. When you add the only to that 3, oh my gosh, you get a drama queen, or you get a drama king, because all that power of the only goes into all those characteristics, and then all of a sudden they're manipulating everybody around them, and it's a fascinating thing. Now let's see, we got one more. We got number 4. That's the true baby in the family. Everybody takes care of the baby. So the baby's not real responsible because other people take care of him. He can do better in school because he's got the older siblings that have been teaching him stuff. But, he wants to be taken care of. He interacts really well with adults because he's been interacting with these older siblings. So adults really don't bother him too much. And he can be very outspoken. And he can be the comedian in the family, too. He's always the little kid that's, we have to tag along. He's got to come along. We don't want him. He wants to come along, but, the older siblings don't want him with him. So he gets to be loud and outspoken. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. We won't get too complicated by adding the onlys to them.
And so is the function of these birth order archetypes so implicit that you believe it would stand true if the characters in the playing field didn't know the actual birth order? Like, for example, if a whole family got bonked on their heads and they didn't know anyone's birthdays anymore, and the children were of a similar enough age where it would be ambiguous of who actually was born first, do you think naturally they would then all fall into their actual place, or is it more of an inherent, or is it more of like a programmed social construct that happens?
Well, that's good. It's very psychological. In other words, who knows what these 4 were? Now they're all mixed up. Eventually, of those 4, one's going to take the 1 position, the 2 position, the 3 position, the 4 position, even though that might not be exactly right. Now, I'll give you an example how this works. It works with twins. When I see twins in an office, I can tell even identical twins, who's the older twin by their tooth development. And as they get older, which baby tooth falls out first and which twin, that's going to be the older twin. But if the parents have said that the younger twin is the older, then they will take the role of that birth order position. So it's psychological. It's not anatomical. So if they think they are the older twin, now an example of one set of twins where the parents refused to tell the twins who was older. You're laughing. But it wasn't a laughing matter, because what was interesting is, and they were the only 2 in the family. Some days when they come in, they were both treated together. One was like number 1 and one was like number 2. And other days, number 2 was like number 1 and number 1 was like number 2. And they had real problems in school. And I followed them later on in life, lots of psychological problems. They never found out who was the older twin. Everybody wants to know who they are. You have to have an identity. And with twins, sometimes they end up speaking a different language, only the two of them can understand. Well, with these two twins, they never could separate themselves. They were twinned, and the parents didn't separate them into their individual personalities. They just confused them together, and all their life it was confusing. So that was a great question, because that's what happens, and that's what happens in real life.
Fascinating. So I imagine those parents perhaps had the best of intentions, thinking that they were maybe doing a good service to the both of them, not, maybe looking at them as equals. But this whole equality concept, it is very much a fallacy to a large degree. We do have a natural pecking order and a natural birth order that plays a role. And when we defy that or don't know where to calibrate ourselves on that spectrum, it's very confusing, evidently.
Yes, and I did ask the mother. I said, "Why don't you tell the girls which one's older?" She said, "Because we didn't want any competition between them." But that's exactly what happens between number one and number two. They're competitive, and that's where you get, the sibling rivalry thing.
And
So
so,
you're right.
and so let's talk about that sibling rivalry. Is it positive? Is it negative? Can it be both? Can it help the advancement of both siblings or all the siblings, or is it more destructive than it is good? And what are the factors that make it one versus the other?
Sibling rivalry is excellent as long as it doesn't go too far. You life is tough, and you have problems in life, and sibling rivalry kind of gets you started to understand that people are different and you have to, fight for what you want. But if it goes too far, and I'll give you some examples of that, number two can demote number one or dethrone him. And number one can make life so impossible for number two to be a student or an athlete or whatever that he gives up. You don't want the kids to give up. You want them to continuing to have a little animosity between them. They say kids fight, that's good. But if you can't win the fight and there is no way to win, number one, he drops out. I've seen this in my practice. They drop out. They don't know who they are anymore. This is when they get into alcohol and drugs and other problems. And the same thing can happen if number one makes it so impossible for number two to achieve anything. So I tell the parents, I said, make sure that your two kids, especially two boys, don't play the same sport. Make sure they've got different sports so they don't have to compete and demote each other. Someone could be good at soccer and someone could be good at baseball or good at football. But if you put them together, you're just creating more of the sibling rivalry to try to knock off the other. And that happens more often than we think.
Fascinating. I would push back on that in a sense that I think that probably happens more often than not, especially in Western societies where the family unit and the family structure is so disenfranchised, and people aren't necessarily taught the value of sticking together with your siblings or your family at all. And so what we see is this individualism and destruction of the family unit from within every single person's mind and then of the home itself. But I think perhaps the greatest strength in all of that would be them if they can get those mental constructs that, hey, we are going to compete, but we are also on the same team. But it's going to be like an iron sharpens iron effect. And ultimately, while we might compete in house, it is me and you versus the world. I think that would be the ultimate to strive for. Would you not?
Yes, and sometimes it does happen. But I'll give you a little story about something that the kids had nothing to do with, but the parents had everything to do with. I had two boys The first boy, everything was fine. The second boy, um, he was named for his father. So he carried the title of junior. The first boy was not named for the father. As they grew up, the first boy, he just couldn't get it together. And as they grew up as adults, the second boy, who was named for his father, ends up working in his father's business. And number one boy never could hold a job. His whole life, it just never worked out. And I always wondered, why did they name the second boy, junior for the father and not, and the first? And I don't have the answer to that question, but it shows you the power in a name. And it was just the psychology of it. So number two had no trouble dethroning his older brother because he was named for his dad.
Yeah.
But if you want to take a little more subtlety in today's culture now, what happens when the dad is not the breadwinner? It's the mother. Okay. I have it where I have the mother's the breadwinner, she's the doctor, and the dad's a stay-at-home dad. And who do these kids relate to? Where is the power? And these are all the subtleties in understanding the family structure that make up who these kids really are. And it gets more complicated every day.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I do believe it would be very much a rarity for a second born or a second born son, especially, to be given the junior designation. And it sounds like in this circumstance, as could be expected, it's very much a disservice and harmful to number one, because that is normally a privilege and an honor and a title that is given to that firstborn, and perhaps rightfully so. But let's explore that. What do you think is the ramifications, positive or negative, if there are any, of naming a firstborn in a junior sense? What does it do to him? What does it do to the other siblings, etc.?
Well, I think if the firstborn is named a junior, it just cements his position and he becomes dethronable. Okay. In other words, nobody can get at him. He is who he is. He's the second in command, and it's over. There's no way that you're going to dethrone him. And it's very interesting when you were talking about, it's really great when families get together and it's us against the world and we're going to all work together. And that works when number one has the throne, number two knows their place, they're different, they're okay in their way they are, and they're not challenging number one, so the two of them can work together. I see a lot of times, you have to look at the genders. Are there two boys? Is it boy, girl, boy? Is it two girls? This is an interesting thing that I recently came across the answer to. Two girls. The two girls, you don't see much sibling rivalry like you do with two boys. It must be the testosterone. But with the two girls, there's a little sibling rivalry, but you don't see much. But number one really crushes number two, crushes them in school. They don't seem to give that number two girl a chance. As soon as number one graduates from high school, number two girl blossoms. I see this all the time. All of a sudden, and sometimes it's while they're still in treatment, because our treatment usually goes a couple years. I see what happens when one went off to college and the other one's still around. And all of a sudden, I see a totally different girl in number two. So for some reason, it's like her thumb, somebody took the thumb off her, and she just develops into a totally different, self-assured person. It's great.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's like the female dynamics are more subtle in subversion and not necessarily allowing for the challenge and the clash, although the tension is there all the same. And then once it is eliminated, that number two can then come up. Does that same phenomena at all happen in male 1 and 2, or is the more so presence of an external and implicit clashing all along not necessarily make it that different when the number one kind of goes off wherever he does go off to. Does a number two male blossom in that way when a number one moves away or moves on?
I haven't seen that because the number two male, um, he's the athlete. He's more of the fighter, and sometimes he just finds his place and he just lets his brother just do his thing. Um, with the girls, there is some of that athletic stuff now, but the number two might become the cheerleader. See,
Fascinating.
so something like that. But yeah, both things happen. They happen.
So, do a parent's intentions to either have or not have more children make a difference before more children are even had? For example, a firstborn is at first an only child, but do they start to become more of a firstborn only once that second child is born, or does a parent's mental schema change in enough that they externally behave differently towards that firstborn once they're already kind of planning for another child? Does that make sense? You understand?
Yeah, I think what happens is when the firstborn. Well, I'll give you an example of let's say the firstborn child and the parents they just don't go out anymore because they just can't leave that child alone. But we'd never leave it with a sitter. We might leave it with the grandmother, but we're never going to leave that child alone because, well, it's just too special. And then when the second child comes along, it's like, well, this that'll be okay. Maybe we can get a sitter now, and then when the third child comes around, they say, well, we've got to get a sitter. We got to get out of here. And by the time the fourth child comes around, they tell the sitter, they said, look, here's our number. Don't call us unless you see blood.
Uh-huh.
So they get overwhelmed. And I think that's what happens. That's why the number only child becomes a one when the two is born, because now they're not the center of attention anymore. And so the parents can't give that number one all the attention that they used to give. They got to share it with number two. And so now the interaction between the kids gets to be greater than the interaction between the parents. And when you get three kids, you got three kids against two parents. So they just got outnumbered. So that's when all the interaction starts to take place.
Fascinating. Fascinating. And are there certain professions that are gravitated to by different birth orders specifically that fit within kind of their hierarchy and personality traits that get developed? Are there anything that you notice there?
Yes. This is a two-part question. Well, first of all, there's been a number of studies that have been done about birth orders and what happened to people, whatever. The problem with these studies is that they have a big flaw. All they do is they look at the number, you're number one. Well, you could be a dethroned number one. You could be a one only. You could be so many different things. That's not your real birth order. That's not your functioning. But they put these numbers, your 1, 2, 3, into these studies. And so their sample is bad. So the results you really can't rely on. But I've done my own little studies about what's happened to people. If you look around to CEOs of companies, most of them are number ones because they like to be in charge and they like to give the orders. A lot of them are one onlys. That's like a super one. They want to be in charge. A lot of our presidents have been one onlys. It gravitates to that situation. Barack Obama was a one only. Bush became a one only when his younger sister died. So there was a big gap between he and Jeb. So, the one only personalities, they kind of work politically because they're both two generations. There's that only generation and then their generation. So they're generational people. So they can kind of, see both sides of the picture. So it's interesting that way. But if I was just to give you a general view, number ones, they're in charge. They want to run the show, run the business, whatever. Number twos, they can be your athletes out there, as a general rule, an athletic kind of thing. And they can be, the rebels. They want to create a little disturbance and assert themselves in a different way. Number threes, they're the more sensitive ones. They're the artists. They're musicians. They're school teachers. They're nurses. And then number four, well, that's the true baby. They could be athletes. They can run businesses. I can give you examples of all kinds of things with all these birth orders. And the easiest way to explain it is if you have an attorney, there's attorneys can be real estate attorneys. They can be, attorneys for murder cases. They can be attorneys for corporate law, whatever. And what's interesting is that they all have similar birth orders. I can't tell you how many attorneys I've found that in real estate that were number threes, because threes like to be outside. They like to look at nature. Real estate was perfect for them. So you say, well, why did you become a real estate attorney? I don't know. I just kind of like that. So it's the subtlety that's running behind us all the time that makes these decisions. Basketball players. I'm thinking of Michael. Help me on this.
Jordan?
Michael Jordan, right?
There you go.
Michael Jordan was a four. Okay. And he was perfect as a basketball player. But when he became a CEO, he wasn't so good at that. A couple of his ventures didn't work out. He wasn't set up to be a CEO. He was set up to be Michael Jordan, the great basketball player, and he was the kid, number four. So if you look at what's behind these people, all of a sudden you start to see patterns that are taking place. I can give you examples of some of these birth orders that would, you might say, that kind of makes sense. I'll give you one that's been in the news recently. Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan is a number three. He's the sweetest guy that you'd want to know, but he doesn't want to show you he's sweet. He's tough. Okay, remember I said laughing on the outside, crying on the inside? His persona is he is tough as can be, but he's really a sweet guy, and that he was when he was in high school. He was a great big guy, but he was really a sweet guy. He didn't want to hurt anybody. But then he figured, well, he was going to do something with his, his size, and he did. Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg have the same birth order. They're both number twos with older sisters.
Yeah, that sounds about right for both of their personalities.
Isn't that interesting? They don't want to be told what to do. In fact, Bill Gates, when he was running his company, he had all his people be independent contractors. They weren't employees. They were all independent because he says, I'm independent. I don't want anybody telling me what to do. So if you understand your birth order, you can understand the CEO of the company, their philosophy. That's, all companies, they have the philosophy of that CEO. So this is where birth order just extends to every part of your life. And if you start to see it, all of a sudden you say, that's been going on? I didn't realize that, and it's kind of interesting.
Certainly, and it's going to end up affecting any sort of interpersonal relationship of any degree, whether it's business, whether it's relationships, whether it's walking by and talking to a stranger and chatting them up on the street. It's if it's so inherently part of who we are and how we present, keeping that in mind of who we are interacting with can help us optimize a scenario to our benefit, and ideally to a mutual benefit, but certainly to a benefit, period. And so let's dig into the relationship side of things. In romantic relationships, Are there certain combos that go together very well? Are there certain combos that very much don't work? Is it, a male one and a female two go together? Is it a female one and a male one might clash too much? What kind of combos work or don't work generally there, would you say?
I hear that question all the time,
Yeah.
and I've got the answer. There's two kinds of love at first sight, and I'll tell you how this works. Okay, the first kind of love at first sight is if you meet someone with your same birth order. If you are one and you meet another one, by the way, your best friend will usually be your same birth order because you see life the same way. You interact similarly, so you get along. But if you meet a woman that is a number one, like you're a number one, uh, immediately you're on the same page together. But there is a problem. You're a lot alike. You each want to be in charge. And I use the analogy, there only can be one image in a mirror at a time. So somebody has to get out of the mirror. In other words, you might be in charge of domestic affairs and she might be in charge of international affairs. In other words, you can't occupy the same place. So every birth order combination will work. Some take more work than others. So, but one type of love at first sight is seeing somebody, your same birth order, you get along immediately, you hit it off, and things don't get rocky until you try to occupy the same space. And then if you decide that you want to separate your duties and things, that works out okay. The second kind of love at first sight always works. I've never heard of or seen a divorce that was the second type of love at first sight. Are you ready? Okay. If you mimic your childhood birth order in gender and in number, for instance, let's say you have a younger sister. If you met a woman that was number two and had an older brother, you would mimic your childhood birth order. You understand a number two girl, and the number two girl understands a number one brother. And so it's perfect understanding. You don't get in each other's way, and it's perfect. Now, let's say that you had a number three girl in your family. Well, she could find a man that had a number three sister, and it would match her childhood birth order. So as long as you match what you grew up with, it works. Now here's where it comes tricky. Let's say that you were a family of all boys. You might match the number, but not the gender. So you have a blank spot. It's like, well, I know my third brother, but you're the third girl. So, but you're not like my third brother. You're somewhat like him, but not quite. So you don't quite match, but that's why the gender, and of course nowadays with mixed gender marriages and things like this, you can all figure that out. But if you can match your childhood gender, that's another type of love at first sight, and it is fantastic.
Now, is that only an applicable scenario when the family unit that we're referencing against is a healthy one? Can a very unhealthy or toxic family unit then kind of corrupt that internal psychology? And if they find someone that fits into that schema that is familiar, have a disdain or a wanting to kind of shy away from, or like an internal disturbance towards finding themselves in that scenario again? Would you hypothesize?
You are so good. It's a great question. I mean, this is how it all works. We just talked about sibling rivalry and dethroning. Okay, so let's say that this number two girl found this number one boy, but the number one boy had been dethroned by his number two sister. All of a sudden, she's not getting a number one boy. She's getting a dethroned number one boy who's not quite right. He's not that number one that she thought she was getting. And that's the fly in the ointment. And it's exactly what you said. It's if you look at the family structure and if you find out the real birth order, it works. But if you don't understand it and you're just going by the numbers, half the time it's not going to work. But yeah, that's excellent question. Excellent.
Very fascinating. And so let's talk about yourself and how you've related to all of this information, because it started as a study of those in your orthodontist chair, but how has it helped you in your own life? And so I guess the preliminary question is, what is your birth order and or true birth order? And how has the study of this helped you kind of comprehend yourself and navigate the world yourself?
Well, the first thing is once you understand who you are and how you're going to relate to the other birth orders, that's the first step. But what I tell everyone to become a birth order sleuth, you say, well, how can I understand birth order? How can I find out somebody's birth order? Like my auto mechanic or whatever. I mean, that's kind of personal and might be illegal. I said, no, it's pretty simple. The first thing you say is, you said, did you have any brothers or sisters? Everybody talks about that. They say, oh yeah, I had three sisters. And you say, well, were you oldest or younger? Where were you in the line? And they tell you the number. And then you ask the next question. Were there any big gaps between anybody or groups of people in the family? Any 4-year gaps in school between any of the siblings? And once they tell you that, then you know all the double birth orders in the family. And that's all you need to do. Just 2 questions. Do you have any brothers or sisters? And were there any big gaps between anybody? Everybody knows that. They know their brothers and sisters. And then you know who you're dealing with. Now, for me, I found out, I mean, it took me a number of years, but once I understood birth order and with my patients, I knew exactly what to expect from my patients. I knew which patient had a high threshold of pain, which patient didn't. I remember one story of one of my patients. He was a young adult. He was in his 20s. He was about 6'3", 250 pounds. I mean, just a massive guy. And I found out he was a number 3 birth order. I knew that. And I said, look, we're going to use the lightest forces I possibly can use. He says, how did you know I was such a wimp? And I said, well, I just tell this to everybody. But I knew that he was not going to handle the pain very well. He says, now that I understand, I was really worried about this because I heard it was very, very, it was going to hurt a lot. But now that you told me that, I feel very comfortable now. So that's how you can use it to understand other people. Sometimes another birth order that has extremely high pain threshold is a 2 only. Remember, 2 doesn't want to have people tell them what to do. The only gives them more power. But the 2 only, I've had little girls, 9, 10 years old, 90 pounds. They can break the strongest appliance I can put in their mouth and not even know it. And I say, well, your daughter just has a high pain threshold. She said, how'd you know that? Well, I knew it because what her birth order was. She says, she falls down, she skins her knee. She never puts a Band-Aid on it. Whereas some other kids, they have to put the Snoopy Band-Aid on it and it stays on forever, so they take it off. And so that's how it helps me. I try to find out the people that I'm dealing with so I can deal with them appropriately by their birth order. And it makes a difference.
And so what was your birth order?
My birth order, I'm a number 2.
And how do you feel that has affected you in your own life? Like, can you think of examples of, now that you understand all of what it means to be a 2, is there things where you look back and say, that made sense? Well, what kind of things are those?
Yes. I'm a number two. I have an older sister, and who was very good in school, as a number one should be. But as a number two, um, I had a little dethroning effect on her only because I was the boy in the family.
Mm.
But I wasn't really aware of it at the time. I'm more aware of it now, but and she responded to that, but I didn't know what was going on. But when I started in my career, I started teaching at the university level. And although I was an orthodontist and I was also in private practice, I realized in the university I was being told what to do. And I really didn't like that. And so I went off on my own and did my own thing and was very happy because of it. So I might say that once you understand who you are, you understand why you do the things you do. And by the way, the love of my life happens to be a number one girl with a younger brother, which happens to be a love at first sight kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
It does work.
Fascinating. Now, are there any particular and inherent challenges that you look back and say that you faced and either had to overcome or perhaps struggled to overcome because of your positioning as a two?
Yeah, probably knowing now that, I really didn't get into this until I was a practicing orthodontist. So, there was a number of years through my education that, you have conflicts and people and things that went on. Now, when I can look back on it, I can see why I reacted the way I did. And that's the important thing about your self-awareness. And I now, won't put myself into situations that I'm not going to handle very well because I know who I am. And, some arguments are worth winning and some are worth walking away from.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In regards to parenting, I presume that the way that someone is inherently absolutely affects how they then function within their family as a parent. Are there certain parenting styles or behaviors or traits that are common within certain birth order types? Like, is a one father a certain way, usually a two father, a three father, etc.? It doesn't have to be that specific, but there are any kind of specifics that you know of?
That's exactly true. And then, sometimes the parents want to live through their kids, or they want their kids, of course, to do better than they did. I'll give you an example. I had one father that was he was a high school football hero, kind of like Al Bundy, the shoe salesman who made 4 touchdowns in a single game for Polk High in that sitcom, Married with Children. Anyway, this guy was very similar, and every time he'd come in, he'd have to talk about his football career and whatever, but it was only in high school. His first 2 kids were girls, and that was kind of a disappointment to him because he wanted that boy to become that football player. And then, sure enough, the 3rd kid, that was his son. And he put a lot of pressure on that boy to become the football player that he always wanted to be, professional or whatever. But the kid, he was not interested. Remember, he was a number 3. And actually, he was more interested in art than he was in football. But he went along, at 8 years old, he had his cleats on or whatever. I could never get him in to appointments after school because he always had football practice. Well, it turns out, as life goes on, remember, I've followed these people for years, that he didn't play football when he was in college. He didn't in high school. He wasn't that good. He sat on the bench a lot. He ended up in New York as a famous graphic artist, very successful. And what I found out was that while he was sitting on the bench in high school, he was doing drawings of his football classmates and giving them the pictures after the game. And so he was a disappointment to his father, but the father, as a number 1, he wanted this number 3 boy to become this number 1 football player, like he was, and it wasn't going to happen. So, yes, the parents do have an influence, but not as much as you think. the birth order and the interaction and who they are eventually comes out. What I like to say is that you can pick any job you want, but after 20 years, you will find the job that matches who you are, and you'll be successful. But if you don't know your birth order, you might be zipping around back and forth trying to find what it is that's going to be right for you, but eventually you find the right one.
Fascinating. Yeah. And the reason I asked that is not necessarily, in regards to what it does to the child, but more so in that relationship, because those birth orders between two individuals affect an interpersonal relationship. I would imagine that, for example, a two father and a one son might have a very fascinating relationship because inherently in a father-son structure, a father should be the leader or the head figure. But if that father is a two, if they're even a very weak two, and the son is a very strong and prominent one, that creates some very interesting power dynamics, does it not?
Yes,
And
yes, it does.
yeah,
Um, the father that's a number one with the number one son, there's a lot of ego that goes with that. But the number one son, unless he's dethroned, is going to be very good with that number one father. And usually in the traditional sense, the number two child is closer to the mom, and the number one child is closer to the dad. Be he a boy or be a girl. In other words, it's the first child goes with the leader. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the leader is the same birth order. He could be the breadwinner in the family. It could be a two or three or something like that, but still the number one child would gravitate toward the strongest parent.
fascinating.
I
Yeah.
don't know. Did you have a strong parent?
What's that?
Did you have a strong parent?
Well, there is always a stronger and a weaker. Whether any of them classify as outwardly strong, that's up for debate. But there's always a stronger and a weaker.
Yeah.
So, I wish I didn't tell you my birth order when we were on our pre-meeting. I wish I made you guess because that would have been interesting to to explore right there. Interesting.
I can tell you some other things about birth order. What I found in my office was that my front desk people that would be outward to the public, an only child was great. Okay, because they like to be in charge. They see the whole thing, and they're more the adult-like person, and of course they can relate to the parents well. Number ones work pretty well in that position too, because they're like the border collie. They like to get everything together. Oh, like you, the border collie. And then what I found was in the clinical area where we're dealing with multiple children at the same time, the number threes and number four birth orders were great at that because that's how they grew up with multiple kids. And then the person that seemed to gravitate toward accounting and back in the lab working by themselves was the number two, who didn't want to be told what to do. And, when I would give presentations at orthodontic meetings, I'd ask for a show of hands. And sure enough, that seemed to work. The people that have had these jobs for 15 and 20 years, it was that birth order. So eventually they didn't start that way, but eventually they got to that spot.
Yeah, very fascinating, because we talked about it earlier on in the conversation in that if you analyze the CEO of the organization, you can kind of get a feel for what the dynamics will be under them for yourself to enter. But we can very much use it in the opposite direction in looking to hire people and then place them in ideal and optimized scenarios for their birth order and how they might behave based on that. Very.
Yeah. And what's really good, I did some work with HR people, because what you want to do is hire the person for the job, not find out that they don't match the job and you've wasted the time and the money and the effort. So if you could hire the right people for the right job first, you're going to save that company a lot of money. The other thing is that when you work with groups, uh, and who do you put in charge? A deadly situation is if you put someone at a lower birth order in charge of people with higher birth orders. Then they look at that person, they say, no way, you're not, I'm higher than you. So you put a number 3 in charge, and now you got ones and twos. And also, I tell HR people, be careful. You're going to start hiring everybody with your same birth order because you're going to like them. But that's wrong because you have to hire different birth orders. A team would work best if it's like a family. You got a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4, and they all have their own spots and they don't overlap, but they can be really creative together because they see the whole picture differently. So working with teams, I mean, I can see in your face that you're saying, "Oh my God, I never thought about that." But it's true. When you mix these birth orders, you don't get the conflicts that you do if you have multiples with the same birth order. But that brings up another story. I have a lot of stories, but this happened to be a company that I was dealing with. That it was a barge towing company, and the parent of the company, the lead company guy, and his secretary would do a lot of traveling. And she told me one day they were in the Miami airport, and they were waiting between planes, and they said they'd have lunch, and her boss got a Dr. Pepper, and she said to him, "Could I have a sip of your Dr. Pepper?" And he said, "No." He says, "I'm an only child and I don't share." And she said, "I need to go back to what you were telling me about the birth order. My boss is an only child. He won't share anything with me." So, it all of a sudden, when you start to see it and feel it and see it in everyday life, it sure makes a lot of sense.
Very fascinating. You mentioned that someone in a particular birth order will naturally gravitate towards and like others of their same birth order. Is that always the case, or do some birth orders prefer to surround themselves usually with others for certain reasons?
No, I don't. I don't think so. Again, if you find your real birth order, even though someone might be a 1 that's now a 2, and you're friends with them, and you say, "How can that be?" Well, maybe that's a 1 that got demoted to 2, and now they're acting like a 2 and not a 1 anymore. But it's the people that you see eye to eye with, you get along well with, the relationship is relaxed, and it's usually your same birth order. I don't know if you can think about your friends, but you have to find out their birth order. But it works.
If you were constructing a family from scratch, right? You could pick any combination that you want. What would your ideal and optimal roster look like to optimize the whole family unit and every individual? And so, I mean, what number is the father? What number is the mother? And then what's like the orientation of the children? Do we have a 1 male or a 1 female, and then a 2 female, 1 male? What's your golden family unit look like with birth order in mind?
That's a very difficult question to answer. And I'll tell you why. Because all different birth orders can marry and have children. But what you have to understand is that the parents, only for the only child, are not that important. It's the interaction between the kids that make them who they are, except for the only. And the only child, I'll give you an example. If you have a parent that one of them is an only and one of them is a 2, but she may have had only parents, as well. But so we have an only child that has a parent that's an only and one that's a 2. That only child may end up marrying a number 2 because he or she is an amalgamation of the only and the 2. So the only child is influenced by the parents. The other ones, they could be any birth orders. Uh, one of the gals in my office happens to be a number 4, and her best friend is another number 4, and they decided to go to lunch one day, and they both got out there together, and they said, "Well, where are we going to lunch?" And one 4 said to the other 4, "I don't know. I don't know." He said, "Wait a minute. Let's talk to our kids." They both had 2 girls, a 1 and a 2 girl. They said, "Look, let's go to the school, check our girls out of school, the oldest girls. They'll tell us where we should go to lunch." And they did. They checked the 2 girls out, and they went to lunch together. They told them where to go.
They just needed someone to take charge.
Someone to take charge. And their children were at higher birth orders than the parents. And so that's how it worked. So, parents are older and they control the purse strings and they do stuff like that. But once the kids had their birth orders, they can be more powerful than the parents. It's kind of interesting.
Very fascinating. Yeah, there's all sorts of things that come into play, and then I believe an extra layer of complication would be if who in this hierarchy is healed or unhealed, or has that chip on their shoulder, or has done inner work, or is that all a conscious individual versus just an emotional, unconscious individual. There's so many levels of nuance and complication and gray area that come into play, but I certainly think there's no argument for anyone that has any sort of emotional intelligence that this birth order concept and construct, it is very much real and unavoidable, because as we look around and look at ourselves and look inwards, I would struggle to find perhaps, if any, exceptions to these rules in these cases, of course, always being possible.
Yeah, the exceptions to the rule, and when I worked it out, there's probably about 19 birth orders. And I'll tell you how that happens. If let's just take the 3rd child. If you have a 4-year gap and then there's no other children after that, this child becomes a 3 only double birth order. That was a drama queen. That was actually Shirley Temple, except that wasn't Shirley Temple, because there was an 8-year gap between Shirley Temple and her 2 older brothers. So she became an only 3. She had 80% only characteristics and 20% the 3. So that's 2 birth orders in one. One's a 3 only if it's 4 years, 50-50. But when you give 8 years, now it's 80-20. So if you really understand birth order, you can solve every problem. And it's just kind of interesting. But I learned this over time. It wasn't that simple. It wasn't just only 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's what's unique about my book, Life's Fingerprint, is that I put all these combinations in, and I use people that celebrities, politicians, whatever, with these birth orders, so you can say, "Oh, I understand that. That's the kind of personality that is." Superman, he was an only child. And he was in charge. He was going to save the world. Okay. I'm not sure what Lois Lane was, but anyway. But so in the book, I try to give all these examples so that you can, also I try to do it with genders too, like two boys and 1 girl, 2 girls and 1 boy, so all those possibilities are in there. But it's just not that simple, but it works.
Yeah, it's a lot going on there. And so the book, please do tell us more. What's it called? Where can people find it? Who should seek out the book, and why should they read it? Tell us what about the book.
Hold it up here. Is Life's Fingerprint. And you can get it through our website. This is hardcover with color pictures in it. It is on Amazon. The first edition was soft, and it was black and white. This is a coffee table book. Fits on the coffee table. We also have it as an audio book, and through our website, we have the audio on a little USB, so you can just plug this in, and it's got all the pictures as well that are in the book.
Nice.
So I kind of prefer the one that's a coffee table because you put that on the coffee table, especially during Thanksgiving, when everybody comes back and everybody is playing the same role they did as when they were kids. Okay. Even though they became the investment banker and they have $1 million, they're still the kid they were when they come back for Thanksgiving. It doesn't change.
Interesting. We don't have time to go into it too much, but I think that goes back to a conversation I was mentioning earlier of the healed versus the unhealed order. Because I think I've observed in my time, those with a certain order and given certain roles and responsibilities, and I think it's especially true for number ones, if they feel parentified perhaps, or they feel like they didn't necessarily get to have their childhood as a number one. I've observed some people when they do kind of get into those family gatherings later on in life, it appears that some people go into a very childlike state and they look to perhaps seek out a different birth order than always being that one that was in charge. And that's so there's a lot of fascinating
It's
things that
interesting.
happen.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've seen some people do that. But in our closing minutes here, please, where can, oh, so beyond the book, you have workshops that you do as well. Is that correct? You do speaking events. Are you available for hire for speaking events? What else do you do with this
Yes.
concept?
Well, we only have so much time. So lately now we've been trying to go to the speaking events, trying to use Zoom. So physically we don't have to go to places. But we do workshops. We do workshops for businesses, and we have to be a little careful because of all the federal laws and hiring and things like that. But some people, will gravitate to this, and some people will say, I don't think this is for me, and that's okay, But we do that, and we have two websites. The Life's Fingerprint website, we have a lot of videos and information there. But then if you go to mybirthorder.com, that's where we actually have the store where you can buy. We have T-shirts with number one would say, I'm in charge, put me in charge. Number two would say, don't tell me what to do. And number three says, I feel your pain. And number four says, I don't want to grow up. The true baby in the family. So we have a few things in our store, but we want to get the information out there because it sure makes your life so much easier because it's predictable.
Yeah.
I really thank you for the interview. It's been great.
Yeah, no, this is a wonderful time. And I have a closing question for you. I do have as many minutes or seconds that you'd like to take to answer this, so you can keep it as long or as brief as you would like. But for a closing message and a closing thoughts, would you like to segment a closing message to different birth orders? Like in closing, what would you say to a number one, a number two, and so on? That you'd really want them to take home from this conversation and from understanding this concept.
Right. I would say to the only child, there are more people in this world than just you. The whole world doesn't revolve around you as much as you think it might. For the firstborn, I would say you can make mistakes. It's okay not to be perfect. You don't have to be perfect, number one. You can make a few mistakes, and the world is not going to come to the end. For number two, you don't have to always have it your way. You can sometimes, be a little more giving and, follow someone else's lead. You don't have to be so obstinate and stubborn. For number three, that's the world will not come to an end because you're not saving it. So you can do great things in this world, but the world will still be here after you're gone. And for number four, life is a lot of fun, but sometimes you have to buckle down to make a living in this world. Other people can't just take care of you all the time. So that would be my statements for these people.
Great closing messages to keep in mind.
Oh, and the other thing I'll say to parents, do not treat all your children alike. They are all different, and let them be different because they want to be different. And that's the beauty of having a family of multiple children.
I love it. I love it. I think that could extrapolate out to all sorts of societal levels and all sorts of dynamics.
There's no bad birth orders. No bad birth orders.
No bad birth orders, and this, farcical concept of total equality for all that's just not, unfortunately, based in reality. Trying to enforce that upon a populace, upon a family, upon children, it only leads to chaos and destruction and the dragging down of everybody. So
Absolutely.
Allow those to be who they're going to be and who they are, and allow the strengths to proliferate and allow people's weaknesses to exist because they're going to. Let's do what we can.
You are wise beyond your years. You really are.
Yeah, I'm trying here. I'm trying. There's a lot to learn. I got plenty to.
Thank you so very much.
Dr. Robert Hurst, thank you as well very much for coming on the show.
Bye.